Greetings. Are we on? Are we live? Yeah, I think we are. Hi there. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for joining me. Give me just 1 second here. As you know, I'm just trying to figure things out. Okay. All right. Thanks everyone for joining us. Yeah, I refer to myself in the plural. Sometimes it's a royal thing, I guess. But we got a lot to talk about today. It's the big topic of the Muslim persecution of Christians. Now, this came about because 1 week ago, last Friday, actually, I released a video where I interviewed a Catholic priest, Father Samuel Maria. And it was a good video, and we spoke. I explained in that video, of course, we had some technical problems, but he got to say what he had to say, which was good. And those who watched it got an idea of what's happening in Nigeria, which is basically mass carnage of Christians. Various reputable human rights organizations, politicians, human rights activists have actually labeled it a genocide, an actual genocide of Christians at the hands of the Muslims. Nigeria is half Muslim, half Christian. So you can see what happens when you have an equal force of both living side by side. And as I looked at some of the comments, it became clear to me that although this sort of thing is happening in Nigeria and broader, which we will be talking about, it's also very little known. The Muslim persecution of Christians is as widespread and horrific as it is completely absent from the Western consciousness, including, if not especially, among Christians. And we'll be talking about that. So that's what this particular stream is about, hence this live stream. The fact is, what's happening in Nigeria is just the tip of the iceberg. And so we're going to unfold all that, the how, why, what the deal is, what's going on, and why you don't know about it, and why they don't want to tell you about it, which is, of course, the real big question. And as you'll see, it'll fit in with a lot of other things that a lot of other big questions that we've been asking. So first, a little bit about my background with this particular topic. The Muslim persecution of Christians. It's always been near and dear to me for maybe obvious reasons based on my own ethnic background. You may or may not know, I was born here in the United States, but my family's Coptic Christians from Egypt. And so I've heard a lot of stories growing up. I've visited Egypt and other Middle Eastern nations in my youth and later. I don't do so now for obvious reasons, but and, you know, I've witnessed it, I've seen it, I'm well acquainted with it. And it's for that reason that when I went to college, and you may recall, I did a video where I spoke about my master's thesis. And the reason I did my master's thesis was about the first military interaction between Muslims and Christians. So I've always been interested in that nexus, okay, even from my personal background as well as for the historical context, which I've always found fascinating. And I found it helps explain what is happening in the now. Of course, the historical stories, which I've written about in books like Sword and Scimitar and Defenders of the West, and the new book that's coming out, Two Swords of Christ, are very refreshing compared to this topic, because while they both feature Muslims persecuting Christians, the historical accounts at least have Christians fighting back and trying to protect themselves and other Christians, unlike now, which we'll get into, of course. Moreover, since I started publishing and writing about Islam all the way back in 2005, so going on 2 decades now, this topic, the Muslim persecution of Christians, has actually been one of my main themes that I've written a lot about, probably thousands of articles in those 20 years. And also, since 2011, I'll get into that a little more, I've been publishing a report for the Gatestone Institute every month since 2011, highlighting or focusing on the persecution of Christians in Islamic lands. And we'll talk a little bit about that and its significance. So I know what I speak of when we talk about this particular topic, you know, and I've even written a book. One can say I wrote the book, Crucified Again, Exposing Islam's New War on Christians. This book, just for the record, I actually only recently learned it's out of print, and it's only available on Kindle, and it's very hard to find. If you go online, used copies, I believe, are selling for over $100, which is ridiculous. I don't get any of that, by the way. But I did manage, and this is probably a temporary thing, to actually get a very small amount printed. I think about 15, maybe less, 12, 15 copies, brand new copies. This is one of them right here. If you want it, in the description, there's links on how to get it. And I hope I can figure out how to get more copies going, forward, because that was basically my magnum opus on this particular topic. And again, like I said, you can still get it on Kindle electronic versions, but if you want, go to the description and you can get the book. All right. Without any further ado, let's get into it. Let's start with a few general statistics. Because I like to be objective. I don't want to, none of this is hearsay or rumors or hyperbolic exaggerations. So first of all, one of the good sources for getting statistics is this report that comes out annually. It's called the World Watch List, published by Open Doors, which is a human rights organization that follows and tracks the persecution of Christians pretty well. And they explain their methodology. They have, field workers and external experts, people working in the grassroots, and they compile all this data. And every year they publish a report, the World Watch List, which lists the 50 worst nations in the world to be a Christian in, okay? Meaning the 50 worst persecutors, the 50 nations that persecute the Christians the most, okay? So the latest one that came out in they usually come out in January of every year, and the latest one that came out in 2025 covers basically 2024. So that's the latest info we really have. I think it covers from October 2023 to September 30, 2024. All right. So the statistics I'm going to give you are from that most recent report. Okay. Now, according to it, the global persecution of Christians has reached unprecedented levels. Okay. And this isn't just Muslim persecution of Christians, but global. More than 380 Christians suffer high levels of persecution and discrimination for their faith. That's a direct quote from, let me just shut something down here. Sorry about that. That's a direct quote from the World Watch List that I just cited. 380 million Christians suffer high levels of persecution and discrimination for their faith. The numbers of slain, I've seen different numbers, both there and in different reports, and it kind of tends to be open to debate. But it's definitely in the thousands. Suffice to say that in Nigeria alone, okay, one Christian is slaughtered every 2 hours, all right? And that's on average. So you're talking about 12 Christians every single day, multiplied by 365. Okay. Now look at this. 1 in 7 Christians in the world right now is being persecuted for their faith, which is about 14% of all Christians. In Africa, that number grows to 1 in 5. So 20% of Christians in Africa are persecuted. And in Asia, that number grows to 2 in 5, meaning 40% of all Christians living in the largest continent in the world, Asia, are being persecuted. Okay. Now, the list categorizes 3 levels of persecution, the World Watch List. It has extreme, which is the absolute worst form of persecution you don't want to encounter. It has very high, also bad, and high. And just for the record, high would be, by modern Western standards, just horrific, okay? So you can imagine what extreme and very high are. Now, the top 13 of the 50 nations listed in this list are extreme persecutors, the absolute worst. Now I'm going to read them to you. They are: number 1, North Korea; number 2, Somalia; number 3, Yemen; number 4, Libya; number 5, Sudan; number 6, Eritrea; 7, Nigeria; 8, Pakistan. Look at that. Nigeria, which is where all this horrific slaughter and genocide is happening, is only number 7. Okay. 8, Pakistan; 9, Iran; 10, Afghanistan; 11, India; 12, Saudi Arabia, our great friend and ally; and 13, Myanmar. Okay. Now, again, the extreme persecution, the form of persecution which is experienced in these 13 countries, ranges from basically assault, rape, imprisonment, outright murder, just for being identified as a Christian or attending usually underground churches. All right. Now, unsurprisingly, most of this extreme persecution being meted out to Christians in these 13 nations, 9 of these 13 are either coming from Islamic oppression or it's occurring in nations with large Muslim populations. Okay. So that means that about 70% of the absolute worst, most horrific, extreme persecution around the globe takes place in the name of Islam. Now, this trend that Islam, has the lion's share of the persecution affects the entire list. So the persecution of Christians in a total of 37 of the 50 worst nations that are ranked, or basically 74%, comes from the hands of Muslims, or is in nations with large Muslim populations, which is essentially the same thing. Okay. Now, it's important. I've given you statistics and numbers, and we're going to get into more details. But the one thing that's kind of missing from all these statistics, when you get these dry data, raw numbers, you kind of miss the human element of what's going on here when we're talking about 280 million and Christians being persecuted, and I don't know how many thousands being killed, etc. You need to, when you look at the actual stories, it's pretty graphic and horrific stuff. Okay, so I told you I've been writing these reports since 2011, and the things that I've seen are just atrocious. Acid thrown in a woman's face, a Christian woman's face, because she wasn't wearing a hijab. Girls chained and gang raped. Boys chained and gang raped, often killed afterwards. Christians being burned alive. One of the more notorious cases, which got a little bit of media coverage, occurred in Pakistan, when a husband and wife, Christians, just laborers, someone accused them of burning the Quran or stepping on a page of the Quran. Muslims went crazy and burned them alive, threw them in an oven where they were all working, the kiln. Okay. And it goes on and on, things like families poisoning each other, including husbands and wives, sons and mothers and fathers. Why? Because someone converted to Christianity. They apostatized, and the families outraged at what happened. Okay. And when you read these stories, and we'll get into it in a little bit, it's pretty it's really dramatic stuff that you can make a movie about. But of course, we're not even getting reports about this from the news because it's not worth talking about. Okay. Or a very, very common phenomenon that I've covered dozens, if not hundreds of times, is a group of Christians will be peacefully worshiping in a church, and then Muslims barge in, open fire, screaming Allahu Akbar, detonate themselves, suicide bombing, burn the church with the Christians, and dozens, 50, 100, or whatever die. Okay, that happens all the time. Most recently, off the top of my head, I think in late June, in Syria and Damascus, under the brave new leadership of former ISIS or former Al Qaeda, now U.S. friend and ally, the regime. That's what exactly happened. 2, I believe, suicide bombers entered a church in Damascus, opened fire, killed, I think, 30 Christians, wounded maybe 100, and then detonated themselves to make sure the devastation is total. Okay. And, I've seen over the years the pictures that come out of this sort of treatment is they're really bad stuff. Just little babies decapitated or missing an arm, little girl crying, leg here, skin, blood smeared everywhere. You may recall the famous picture of a fresco of Jesus Christ crucified. And there's blood smeared all over him. That was a Coptic church in Egypt, which was, of course, bombed, and that's the worshippers' blood on it. Very, very common stuff. Okay. Now, again, how many people know of this? Like I said, when we did the Nigerian interview, it was pretty telling to me based on the comments, but I already knew this. I already knew most people don't know it. And the ones who do know it don't really, it's sort of the tip of the iceberg. And why is this? Well, it's the media again. The fake news, or in this case, fake news by omission. And I'll discuss that presently in more detail. But as I was saying, to help remedy these media failures that are ongoing, back in 2011, I decided, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to these small humanitarian websites, which I'm familiar with, including in foreign languages in Arabic. And I'm going to every month try to collate what happens to Christians in Muslim nations and try to publish a report. Now, initially, I was concerned that what kind of report might this be? If, let's say, 1 month comes and there's only 2 instances, right? Or 3, or maybe 1, or none. Well, sad to say, since 2011 till now, and we're talking about over 150 monthly reports, that I've done in those 13 or so years, 13, 14 years. That has never been the case. And if anything, they've grown. Okay. So each report, easy dozen, it's oftentimes 2 dozen anecdotes. And any one of these anecdotes, which you won't hear about in the Western media, if it was Christians doing that to, let's say, Muslims, you would hear about it. And it doesn't matter how far away the country is or insignificant it may be. All right. So I'm going to read to you from my latest report, which hasn't even been published yet, but I have the research done to give you an idea of what surfaces each month, how this usually goes. So what I usually do, again, is published in the Gatestone Institute and also my website. You can go to my website and just search for Muslim persecution of Christians. And at the very bottom of each report, so if you go to the most recent one, at the very bottom, you'll see links to all the older ones, stretching all the way back to, I think the first one was in July 2011. Okay. So this is August, all right, which should come out in September. I usually start working on them the beginning of the month after the month in question ends. So August, I start compiling in September, but a lot of things that happen in August don't even show up until, September. It gets reported mid-September. So that's why these usually come out a little later. All right, without any further ado, so everything I'm going to read to you now is what has happened in August. And this is just a sampling. If you want the full thing, you'll have to check out the actual report, okay? All right, Mozambique in Africa. Okay, the Islamic State affiliates, basically it's known as the Islamic State Mozambique province, went on a mass slaughter campaign, and it even published photos showing its jihadis raiding, burning villages, burning churches and homes, and beheading Christians. And in August. Same Muslim terrorist groups in the Democratic Republic of Congo. In early August, at least 45 Christians were massacred, many of them decapitated and mauled and mutilated. And again, ISIS published images of this to boast. And, it shows their mutilated corpses, churches desecrated, crosses broken, churches on fire, etc. Once again, underscoring and highlighting the religious dimension. Now, a few days later, also in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in fact, on August 13th, Islamic terrorists of get this, the group is called the Allied Democratic Forces, okay, which has an Islamic terror group. Remember what I told you about the left and Islam? Anyway, a group of these Islamic terrorists on August 13th disguised themselves as priests, entered into a Christian village, and unsuspecting Christians actually went up to them singing before they killed them. They killed only 3 and abducted 8, and they looted and torched homes and churches, etc. Here's a few quotes for you about this particular story. So according to a local church official, they came into our church and stole the robes of our priests and choir. They then put them on, posing as a delegation from another church. It was a devilish plan. To use the very symbols of worship to deceive and destroy is beyond evil. My heart breaks for those who trusted them, thinking they came in peace. And indeed, the Christian villagers, like I mentioned, did welcome the disguised jihadists, singing and greeting to them, and unaware until it was too late. Here's one survivor, Gene Phillip, said this. He was there. Quote, I thought initially that they were genuinely from a church. They greeted us with smiles and songs. It all looked so real. But when I got closer, I noticed guns hidden beneath their robes. That's when my heart sank. I knew we had been tricked. I walked quietly back and then ran into the bush, praying God would protect me. Another woman, Mary Kavora, who, while being interviewed and weeping and mourning her cousin's death, said the following, quote, they were dressed in priestly robes, and everyone in the village believed they were holy men. Who would ever doubt people dressed as servants of God? My cousin followed them while singing, thinking it was worship. He never came back. It feels like faith itself was used against us. Okay. All right. Moving along. Let's go to Nigeria. Of course, you've heard from Father Samuel Maria. But as I told you, this is an ongoing habitual thing in Nigeria, where basically one Christian is killed every 2 hours on average. So here's some of what happened in Nigeria in the month of August. All right, brace yourself. Between August 1 and 5, Muslim Fulani herdsmen slaughtered at least 9 Christians in a string of attacks on Christian villages in Benue State. According to the report, the herdsmen attacked the Christians. According to a separate report on August 5, in another place in the Middle Belt, they killed 17 Christians. 14 of those were, according to the officials, quote, returning from the weekly market when their vehicles ambushed. The victims included women and little babies. This is too much. We can't continue to bury children and the elderly. A total of 70 Christians were slaughtered in this same very region over the last 2-3 months. In 2 attacks in late August, Boko Haram militants killed 8 Christians in Borno State, some while farming and others while asleep in their beds in the middle of the night, which is a very common tactic for the terrorists in Nigeria. They also torched dozens of Christian homes, and according to a spokesman of Borno State, quote, our people, the Christians, whose only pursuit is peace and livelihood, continue to fall victim to cruelty. These men and women deserve to live, to farm, and to dream, but their lives have been cut short by those who thrive on violence and destruction. On August 24th, the same Islamic herdsmen killed 2 Christians in Benue State, following the slaughter of 5 others earlier in the month. According to one local discussing these instances, he said all 7 Christians were killed in the same area where as many as 200 Christians were slain in attacks in June, just 2 months earlier. The Muslims chased and shot at the Christian farmers as if they were animals. On August 24th, Muslim herdsmen slaughtered 7 Christians, including a 1-year-old infant in Kaduna State, in Angwan Rimi village. 3 days later, August 27th, they killed 1 Christian farmer and wounded 3 others in Tafawa, Balawi County. And according to a local source, quote, one of the Christian women was also cut on her hand with a machete. Her teenage son was cut up with a machete. A third victim, another Christian woman, had her ear cut off by the herdsman. All right. So that's Nigeria. Just some of the anecdotes, murderous ones, to surface last month in August. And bear in mind, it's even worse every single month. Now in Uganda, also in Africa, on August 19th, a former Muslim who converted to Christianity was lured to his death by family and friends, Muslim family and friends. His name was Muhammad Nagy. He was 38. He was a father of 5, a married father of 5 children, aged between 4 and 15. And basically, he was looking for work. And finally, after he converted to Christianity, he and his wife and his children moved around to hide from family. But one of them, one of his friends, got a hold of him and pretended that everything was fine. In fact, he wants to help him. And so he offered him a job. And being down on his luck, they're moving around. This is Uganda. Obviously, he needed it. He received the call on August 9th, and Muhammad Nagy, the man who got killed, the apostate, according to his wife, the widow, she said when he got this phone call, his friend, quote, persuaded him, her husband, to leave the house immediately in order to get this job. We waited and waited as time started moving towards midnight. I tried to reach him on phone, but all was in vain. In the morning, a neighbor saw my husband dead at around 6 a.m., and he called me by phone. According to police, the body of the deceased man was found with physical injuries and trauma on the head and was also dragged on a muddy road a distance of 20 meters. There were no signs of strangling. Okay. In Somalia, also August 19th report, it said that since August 6th, Muslim relatives have been keeping a Christian mother and her infant daughter locked up in a room where they were being periodically beaten and starved, all in order to get the woman, their daughter, not the infant girl, but the woman, her name is Fatuma Hassan, she's 28, to get her to renounce Christ and return to Islam. She managed to smuggle a phone conversation with her husband, a Christian, and she said, or actually not with her husband, with some human rights organizations that reported on this. And she, Fatuma Hassan, 28, with a 1-year-old daughter, said, quote, my child has grown very thin for lack of enough food. My child is unwanted in the family, who say, throw away this bastard born of an infidel. We want you back, but not the child. She deserves no right to live. I am always crying for my baby and hope one day I will escape this terrible ordeal to attain my peace and freedom. My family and relatives have sworn that they will not allow me to see the good sunshine until I surrender my Christian faith and return back to Islam. But I am praying for God's intervention to escape and to join my husband once again. I need prayers. Yeah. All right. So her story basically is after she had converted, she left her family home in March of 2024, married this Christian man, and then they managed to remain hidden. Typical story until August 6th, when 6 of her relatives barged into their home. They started beating her and slapping her, and then they just spirited her away. And now, according to last reporting, that's still what's happening. She and her child are trapped in a house, no food, and being periodically beaten. And this, in fact, is one of the prescribed forms of punishments for apostates in one of the madahib, in one of the schools, the 4 jurisprudence schools. Some, of course, say kill the apostate outright, but some of them, I think the majority, say if it's a woman, she should be trapped and beaten until she sees the light, comes back to Islam. Moving along, then there's Pakistan. Pakistan probably offers often in these reports that I do the absolute worst anecdotes, like really despicable stuff and depraved things. And they often are, the chief thing is preying on Christian girls and women, abducting them, raping them, sometimes selling, turning them into prostitutes and making money off of them. Or the lucky ones are forced to convert and then married to their abductors. And more often than not, the judges, the police, the entire, all the authorities, even if it reaches a court, they all side with the Muslim habitually. And they forge fake birth certificates saying the girl's older. She's not 12. She's really 18, things to that nature. They forge conversion certificates saying that she did convert to Islam of her own free will, etc., etc. That, I think, every month there's about 3 or 4 of those stories. Okay, every month. But in this particular month that I'm reporting on, one report that came out said that minority prisoners, especially Christians, endure systematic abuse in Pakistani jails, based on a study that was released on August 15th. They're forced to drink water out of toilets. They're not given toilet paper. They're forced to clean themselves with their hands and then wipe their hands on the wall. But then the report also found that Muslim prisoners, including those in jail for murder and much worse crimes, are given normal drinking vessels and toilet paper, etc., etc. As the report notes, quote, once the religious identity of prisoners becomes public, officials treat them, the Christians, poorly, assigning them menial tasks and refraining from offering them the remission in sentences that are offered to Muslims. And then proof of this came in another August report. And I'll just read to you the quote. Nabil Masih, a 25-year-old Christian from Lahore, died on July 31 after years of neglect, abuse, and lack of crucial medical care in prison. At 16, Masih was accused by a Muslim of posting a blasphemous image on Facebook, allegedly insulting the Kaaba, Islam's holiest site. Police quickly arrested Masih under Pakistan's blasphemy laws, and they even had the image removed to prevent unrest and rioting, because once Muslims hear this happens, it's not enough to arrest. They go insane and just burn and destroy and kill Christians. Okay, and there was a very notable instance of this that happened 2 or 3 years ago. The name of the place is slipping my mind right now. But something like 30 churches were burned and whole villages of Christian homes were torched, and thousands of Muslims rioted and thousands of Christians were displaced. And it was all because of some rumor that a Christian insulted Islam somehow. Okay, but to continue from the quote, so after they arrested him and removed the image so Muslims don't riot, and by so doing, they erased the only evidence that could prove whether Masih had posted it. So in 2018, he was convicted of blasphemy and thrown in jail for 10 years, becoming the youngest person ever convicted under these laws in Pakistan. He spent 4 years in prison, mostly in solitary confinement, facing fear, threats, and mental distress until he died. Okay, so remember what I told you. You hear these statistics. Here's what happens. Here's a young guy, who he was what was he? 16. Okay, when he was arrested because he supposedly insulted the Kaaba of Islam. And look at how quickly and horrifically his life was destroyed. Okay, he spent the next 9-10 years suffering in jail without hope of anything, probably drinking out of the toilet and using his hand to clean himself, and then he finally died. Okay, and I already mentioned to you the constant abduction and rape of Christian girls and women. But according to an August 25 report mentions one briefly, it says, quote, a Christian girl rescued from a Muslim who abducted her said he forcibly converted her, sexually assaulted her as part of a sham Islamic marriage, and forced her into prostitution, just like I was telling you. The forced prostitution resulted in serious health issues for the 16-year-old girl, whose name is withheld as a rape victim. Okay. And when this happens, by the way, in Pakistan, I'm not reading that to you right now, but basically everyone makes clear that the reason that Christian women are being attacked and Christians are being accused of blasphemy is because they know that they're infidels, and they know the government itself is not going to help. It's going to turn a blind eye, because why would it bother when it has the same mentality? Pakistan is one of those many Muslim countries where even its educational system is well known to preach hatred in its curriculum. Okay, it demonizes Christians and other infidels. So it's from top to bottom, the society can just prey on them, and oftentimes even criminal elements. Not that they're terrorists or they even care about Islam, but they know if I want to get away with a rape, or I want to get away with robbing someone or murdering someone, I'm going to target the Christian because they're the outcasts that nobody cares about. Moving along in the August report, then there is the constant Muslim attacks on Christian churches and Christian symbols and institutions and crosses and cemeteries. And this is, again, another constant. Actually, in Europe, I know in France alone, I think something like 2 churches are attacked every single day, or was it every few hours? I mean, really insane numbers, okay? And it's true, because when I do my collating for these reports, I don't even include them. There's entire websites just dedicated to just showing you a church is being attacked constantly, all throughout Western Europe. Right. So here's a few notable ones from August. On August 17th, a Muslim man entered the church of Al-Bunal in Andalusia, broke a stained glass window, damaged sacred objects and crosses, and then he set the church on fire. The authorities arrested the suspect, a Moroccan, reportedly suffering from mental illness. Oh man, this mental illness thing, I've discussed it a lot when it comes to Islam. And whenever a Muslim lashes out and does this and they catch him, immediately it's mental illness. And it's because I suppose Westerners can't begin to understand it. Why would you enter into a church and destroy and break it and burn it? Well, we'll see why. We'll get into that. Okay. And then the best part is the Union of Islamic Communities of Andalusia, an Islamic organization, condemned it, of course. And it said, quote, we wish to emphasize that this act is completely contrary to Islamic values, as well as to the principles of respect and coexistence between religions. We reiterate that this is an isolated incident that in no way represents the Muslim community of Andalusia, whose daily life takes place in a climate of peace, respect, and collaboration. The only problem is this is not an isolated incident. As I already indicated, all throughout Europe, and especially in Spain, churches and crosses are constantly being attacked and desecrated, more often than not, by Muslims. Okay? And this comes out very often. So to call it an isolated incident is of course, a little bit of dishonesty from the Union of Islamic Communities of Andalusia. And then in Italy, also in a late August report, a group of young people, you know what that's code for, and even the report says many of them looking like foreign delinquents were vandalizing and even besieging a church, the Church of Santa Franca. And the priest of the church was told by one of them that, quote, I'm going to burn this church, you SOB. I'll come here with a can of gasoline and burn everything with you in it. And, maybe now it's meet to remember all the churches that are burning in Europe constantly. And oftentimes we're told, oh, we don't know who the culprit is. Remember Notre Dame? Okay. Enough said there. And then on Sunday, also in Italy, on August 24th of Sunday, human excrement was smeared on the outside walls of a historic church in Aversa, in Sant Antonio el Seggio in Aversa. Okay, it was described by everyone. It was shocking and intolerable. The fact is, I actually wrote a whole long article about this, about the fecal jihad. In fact, Muslims have been known, going way back in history, and I documented in my books, of constantly smearing feces and human excrement on churches and especially on crosses, urinating on crosses, and so forth. And almost as if to emphasize that it probably most likely was a Muslim, in Ghana, which is about 20-25% Muslim, and then the rest of it is primarily Christian, feces were strewn throughout a church. I'm reading from an article, which was an act of vandalism that is unusual and shocked all the people. Well, like I said, this isn't very shocking if you actually know the history. It's one of the ways of showing extreme contempt for Christians and their house of worship, churches. So for this particular report, and in fact for all of them, I didn't even begin to list all the attacks on churches, but here's a couple of more headlines. One from Spain. The headline goes, 7 Catholic churches vandalized in August. Bavaria, wave of Christianophobic vandalism. And the article talks about churches being attacked and crosses and statues vandalized and beheaded. And what's interesting is I recall years ago I wrote an article about how Bavaria had a very large Muslim migrant population. Go figure. Also in Germany, quote, here's a headline: religious statue beheaded in beloved cathedral. All right. Very, very common stuff. In Egypt, actually, there was an attack on a church, but this one was very mild compared to what I normally see. So in late August of 2025, the historic Church of the Virgin Mary in Rashid, Bahira Governorate, which was originally a Greek church and was later in, I think, 2005 or handed over to the Coptic Church as the Greeks fled, has been systematically being degraded and turned into a regular building. Crosses have been removed. And in August 2025, a criminal court counselor, a well-respected man, his sons, acting more like they're the sons of a mob boss, came in and continued attacking and breaking the church until Father Luca Assed tried to stop them and started documenting and phototaping them, to which they took him out, beat him, and robbed him. Okay. And Father Luca, called the attack a, quote, attempt to erase the church's historical identity. Okay. And they also in August of last month, August of 2025, the authorities destroyed the protective wall of an adjacent Coptic cemetery, even though there's valid permits. And these walls are usually necessary because a lot of times in these reports, you'll find that there's a lot of Muslim attacks on Christian cemeteries where they exhume the bodies, break the bones, of course, break all the crosses on top of on top of the graves, etc., etc. And then here's one in August from moderate Indonesia, right? On August 2nd, officials and led by Muslim clerics stormed into and closed the Emmanuel Prayer House of Bethel Tabernacle Church. They expelled the evangelist and his son and indefinitely halted all Christians' activities. They justified it by saying they didn't have a proper permit, even though that's open to debate. And the reality, of course, was Muslims were about to riot. Indonesian moderate Muslims, and they actually had to hide and take the pastor and his son and put him in a unknown location. And the result is that 20 local Christian communities were left without a house of worship, and now some are forced to travel 2-3 hours on foot to go to a church, which is very, very common, especially in Egypt. I come across these stories where they shut down churches or they won't allow a church to build, and Coptic Christians have to travel on foot many, many miles just to go to a church. Also in Indonesia, according to an August 8th report, another church in East Java was forced to halt its construction, even though it had all the required permits. The congregation had secured approval from over 200 members and 65 residents. That's what you have to do in Indonesia. If you want a church, you actually have to get permission. You have to get a large percentage of the locals to approve it. And they did. They even exceeded the necessary threshold. But then the authorities and opponents, Muslim leaders, blocked its progress against the law. And according to its reverend, quote, the culmination of the efforts to stop the construction took place on Sunday, July 27th. The construction committee was subjected to a mass lynching by government officials and sheikhs and residents, all of whom were incited by irresponsible individuals, i.e. radical Muslims. Okay. So that is a very, very short summary of what happened in August based on the Muslim persecution of Christian reports that I compile. Okay. And like I said, not only is it just a sampling, but it's not even, I've seen so many worse months that have much more graphic, violent, disgusting anecdotes. Okay. But here's a typical one. All right. Um, Now we're going to get into the why. Why is this happening? Why are Muslims doing this? Why do they have the lion's share of the persecution of Christians, as I mentioned when I was quoting from the World Watch list, the top 50 nations, and there's at least 37 which are Muslim that are the persecutors, and the vast majority of the extreme persecutors are also Muslim. Well, the ultimate source of this is Islamic doctrine, if we're going to be honest. And honestly, there's not enough time to really get into a deep dive of Islamic doctrine vis-a-vis Christianity. Maybe I'll do another video or live stream about that. But like I said, if you do want to look at it, Crucified Again, that's where I really get into it. I break down the doctrines and the teachings that lead to this sort of mentality of attacking, hating, and killing Christians. But I'll leave you with one simple and interesting fact. All right. The 37 Muslim nations that make up the top 50 worst persecutors, if you look at them, they're very different in many respects, racially, socially, economically, and even governmentally. Some are rich, Saudi Arabia. Others are dirt poor, Somalia. Some are advanced, Iran. Others are far from it, Yemen. They're represented by a variety of governments, republics, monarchies, theocracies, and various different races are represented. Arabs, sub-Saharan Africans, Turkic peoples, Pakistanis, Persians, Afghans, even East Asian peoples, as we've seen, Indonesians, Malaysians. Excuse me. The only commonality, so what is the commonality? Okay, if you look at the top 50 worst nations, right? And I just told you 37 of them are really very different in all respects, politically, economically, socially, education, linguistically, culturally, and yet they and racially, ethnically, etc. So what is the common denominator? Well, let's be honest, it's Islam. They're Muslim nations. And so that alone, I think, should dispel any question about if what we're discussing today has something to do, if it's integral to Islam or if it's not. The answer it is. But as I won't leave you without a little bit of doctrine to justify what's going on and why Muslims do this. So basically, Christians, what you have to understand, they're called Ahl al-Kitab. Okay, that's in Arabic, the people of the book. And it's today in the West, by all the apologists, it's bandied around as this wonderful, great thing. They're protected, as if Muslims want to protect them from Mongol aggressors. No, they're protected, meaning as long as they abide by the rules and pay money, okay, then we won't kill you. That's the protection you get. Okay, but the apologists for Islam have strained the meaning of Ahl al-Kitab, people of book, beyond credulity. And in the end, the fact is, Christians are classified as infidels, kuffar, all right? Plural for kafir, infidel. Now, I'll give you a few verses that underscore this. And they're in the Quran. They're singled out for condemnation in the Quran. Quran 573 declares that, quote, infidels are they who say God, Allah, is one of three. That's a clear reference to the Christian Trinity, which Christians believe. Quran 572 says, infidels are they who say God is the Christ, Jesus, son of Mary, which again is what all Christians say. And Quran 930 complains that the Christians say the Christ is the Son of God, Allah's curse be upon them. Okay. Now, the significance of these verses, because you saw infidel, the word kafir is in there, is you need to understand to be a kafir. Okay, here we go again with how English translations don't do justice often to these words. So kafir is often it could be translated as a non-believer, which it's true. To be a kafir is to be a non-believer, but the word is so full of negative, hateful connotations. Okay, to be a kafir means you're the enemy. Okay, you are our enemy, and you need to be laid low one way or the other. Okay, if you don't submit, then you'll be killed. Okay. Now, the only benefit of being a Ahl Kitab, a person of the book, the way Christians are, is that you're given three choices, right? You can convert to Islam once Muslims come and seize your land and take over, and once Muslims are stronger than you. You can convert and join the winning team. or you can pay what's known as a jizya, tribute, as I mentioned. Okay, so now you're being extorted to keep your life, and you can maintain being a Christian, or you have to fight to the death and die. Okay, and that comes from Quran 929. It says, quote, "Fight those among the people of the book," which includes Jews, by the way, "who do not believe in Allah nor the last day, who do not forbid what Allah and his messenger have forbidden." In other words, the people who are not Muslims, because Muslims are not observant of Allah's rules. And the verse continues, and who do not embrace the religion of truth, Islam, until they pay jizya, monetary tribute, with willing submissiveness and feel themselves utterly subdued. Okay, so with that, Christians and Jews, their fate was sealed. They are, in the end, like all other infidels. Okay, they're to be hated. Quran says you have to hate the kafir, the non-Muslim. They're to be warred on, and they're to be subjugated. The only difference is that whereas pagans, who are not people of the book, are to be also attacked and fought, they don't have the option of maintaining the religion. So a Christian can say, okay, I'll pay tribute, I'll pay jizya, and let me keep my religion. So historically, if you're, let's say, a Hindu, you don't have that option. You can either convert or die. Okay, but also historically, Muslims, I suppose, made a virtue of vice in a way. And after they had slaughtered many tens or hundreds of millions of Hindus, they decided, all right, enough's enough. It's better to get some money off these people. And they also extended the jizya option to them and other peoples also historically. So the long and short of it is, to be a person of the book is not really all that great, not the way they try to show it. Okay, and then another very important document, which we need to talk about really before we sort of cap off this general summary of the doctrine that drives the persecution of Christians, is known as the conditions, or in Arabic it's Ahd Omar, okay, which is the conditions or the stipulations of Omar, the Caliph. The Islamic tradition says it's the first Caliph, Omar, the companion of Muhammad, though it may be actually the second Omar from the early 700s, from around, I want to say, 718 and 19. And this document, again, according to Islamic tradition, was supposedly written by a group of Christians who were conquered in Jerusalem around 640, again, when Omar was the Caliph. And so that's why it's called by his name. And until this very day, the Muslim jurists still cite these conditions as containing the main stipulations that Christians must agree to abide by in order to exist unmolested under Islamic rule. And I actually translated the original version in Crucified Again, and I'm going to read to you a little excerpt of it. So Christians had to agree to the following. This is what the conditions of Omar are. Okay, quote, "Not to build a church in our city, nor a monastery, convent, or a monk's cell in the surrounding areas, and not to repair those that fall in ruins or are in Muslim quarters. Not to display a cross on them, the churches, nor raise our voices during our prayers or readings anywhere near Muslims. Never to produce a cross or Christian book in the markets that have Muslims. Never to display any signs of polytheism," because Christians are accused of being polytheists because of the Trinity. "Nor make our religion in any way appealing or try to proselytize anyone," meaning Muslims, "to it. We cannot stand in the way of our relatives who wish to become Muslim. We may not possess or bear any arms whatsoever, nor gird ourselves with swords. We must also honor Muslims, show them the way, and rise up from our seats if they wish to take it, if they wish to sit down in our place." Okay. Now, so that gives you an idea. And what's important is think about the spirit of this, what I just read to you, the conditions of Omar. What is it in a word? It's supremacism, right? It sounds like, doesn't this remind you of segregated America before, Martin Luther and all that, and Rosa Parks? It's just supremacism. So especially the part about, it reminds me of Rosa Parks in the bus. If a Muslim wants your seat, you get up and give it to him. Okay. But this is not racial supremacism. This is religious supremacism, which lots of people have a blind spot for. Okay. But the spirit of what you just read still lives alive very well all throughout. It permeates the Muslim the society, Muslim society. And it's basically, it goes like this. You as a Christian, be grateful that you're even living here. Don't push your luck. Know your place, which was just described to you. I just read it to you, what their place is. Second, third class citizen, depending on how you want to look at it. And don't ever and be thankful. And if you don't, we kill you. Okay, and that's really the story of what's happening right now. Oftentimes, when Muslims rise up and attack a Christian, it's because he's perceived as having somehow said or did something blasphemed against Muhammad. When a very famous theme happens, especially a lot in Egypt, is a Christian man is dating a Muslim woman, for example. Okay, and that's a big no-no. A Muslim man can date and even marry a Christian woman or a Jewish woman because it's a patriarchal society. She's subsumed under his authority. But so you can't have a Christian infidel have a Muslim woman underneath him because he's going to be the leader. We can't have that. So that happens so they're all really related to the spirit of the conditions of Omar, which I just read to you. And so rather tellingly, honestly, if you look at the majority of the persecution today, it's very much connected to these conditions. Churches are bombed, burned, or simply denied permits to exist or renovate. Remember what I read to you? It said that Christians had to, quote, not repair those churches that fall in ruins. The logic was that Islamically, throughout history, the logic was this. Muslims enter, let's say, a Christian region. If you resisted and fought them and they conquered you, every church would be destroyed. If you submitted and you just opened the door to them and embraced your position as a dhimmi, as second-class citizens, churches theoretically were allowed to exist. However, you can't repair it or build it or anything. The logic is, look, we're being good enough, we're letting you keep your church, but when time has its way with it, time has its way with it. And once it collapses, that's the end of it. That literally goes on till today. Okay. In many places, again, in Egypt, it was until very recently, you had to get a presidential decree to actually fix the toilet of your church because it was such a big deal. And if Muslims saw you fixing or, heaven forbid, adding something to a church, numerous riots would erupt. I've seen it again countless times in Egypt and in other Muslim nations. Okay. Bibles, crosses, and other symbols of polytheism, as I just read to you, are often confiscated, destroyed, and or they provoke violent outbursts among Muslims. And again, like I mentioned, especially in unguarded cemeteries, that's a real phenomena that happens all the time where in Muslim nations where cemeteries are attacked and crosses are broken and a lot worse desecration even happens. Christians who openly speak of their faith, remember it said you can't proselytize, or are accused of proselytizing or blaspheming, all of that can lead to death, right? And again, the stipulation for Christians to honor the Muslims, including by offering them their seat, has again led to this entrenched system of contempt for and discrimination against Christians. Remember what I read to you from that one August report in Pakistan, how they treat their prisoners. Because, okay, there's a Muslim prisoner, a criminal, and a Christian criminal. How dare you, you filthy Christian? You're even committing crimes. So now we are going to treat you with extreme contempt and you're going to drink out of the toilet, etc., etc. All right. Now, someone may argue, I talked to you a little bit about doctrine. You know what? Let's look at some chats and whatnot. All right. Okay. Roger, will you do a video exposing the fake history of Edward Said? I don't know if he's deserving of a video. I've actually written a lot about him. In fact, I wrote it in Crucified Again. I think that's the one main area where I discussed him. But yeah, he's, a lot of people, Edward Said, for those who don't know, was, I think, a Columbia professor, I believe Palestinian. And he wrote this book, Orientalism, which I had to read. It was required reading before I entered Georgetown University. When I got accepted in the Center of Contemporary Arab Studies. I read it the summer before I traveled to DC. And, he's a literary specialist. He's not a historian. But the whole point of his book, Orientalism, was to say that in order to justify the colonial era, Europeans demonized Muslims. And that's what Orientalism was. Orientalism, or Orientalists were basically scholars who studied the Orient, European scholars who studied the Orient, and which included the Islamic world, of course. And so according to him, everything they wrote was meant to justify the conquest and colonial takeover of everyone, of every brown person, a lot of them which were, of course, Muslims. And to do that, they demonized them unfairly. So they portrayed Muslims as, let's say, prone to violence and fanatical about their religion and persecuting Christians, et cetera, et cetera. And he said all of that was a lie. It was made up. Didn't matter that we had copious historical documents, right? That's what I do. That's what my history books deal with, to show that he didn't interact with that at all. He just completely said it's all lies. It was all created to demonize Muslims, et cetera, et cetera. And that became a great hit. And I honestly believe it's less to do with him and more to do with the spirit of the age, which was just dying for that kind of logic. Okay, which is dying for that kind of logic to try to once again demonize the West, demonize the Christians, and exonerate the other, right? In this case, Muslims. So it came at the great time, and it became a great hit, and everyone till today, apparently, if you're in a college university, that's what people that's what you're going to be hearing, and that's what's going to be taught, and that's how it's going to be presented. Hopefully there's a new change, but when I was in college, that was definitely how it was presented. So thanks. I don't know if I'll do a video, but there you go. I just spoke a little bit about him. Okay. One of the, why do I take these off? All right. Kevin, one of the few channels, people talking about this. Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. Thanks. Someone's got to do it, right? Super sticker. Okay. Thanks, Nada. The pious way. What are your thoughts on embracing the Benedict option as one of the few effective strategies for responding to all of the social and spiritual evils? I won't lie to you, but I forgot what that is. I actually remember reading someone who wrote about it. What's his name? I think he lives in Budapest now. And I remember the Benedict option, but sorry, kind of forgetting what it is now. If you want to write back, I'll see and tell me what it is. Maybe we can give it a go. Daniel, Raymond is the man. Just discovered him recently, and I've already learned a ton. Well, I appreciate that, Daniel. That's good to know that one's efforts are not wholly in vain. Please do a video on the Islamization of the Caucasus. Yeah. There is so much. I got to be honest with you, people. The things that I can do videos about and write about is just endless, because it's such a fertile field, because nobody wants to do it. Nobody wants to touch it. Okay. It's much better for people to take the safe route, especially if you're an academic or a scholar or historian. You don't want to rock the boat. I've rocked the boat. Okay. And you want to follow the Edward Said Orientalism theme. Okay. And so the fact is, there is so much fertile ground, so many correctives that are needed, especially when it comes to history, especially history that deals with Islam. Okay. So I'll make a note of it, but don't necessarily count on it or hold your breath, because there's a lot more before it that I might have to deal with. Thank you for working on YouTube, Raymond. You are a legend. God bless you. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. It's good to hear. Inspiring. What percentage of Muslims are Arabs, in your opinion? It's actually a minority, believe it or not. Even though the Arabs founded Islam, they're really a tiny minority. I mean, most Muslims, look at the largest Muslim nation in the world is Indonesia. So that's an East Asian. Then you have the Persians, you have the Turks, you have the Central Asians, you have the Sub-Saharan Africans. Arabs are actually, I don't know offhand, but I would say they're a very, maybe 15, 20% of all the Muslims, I'd estimate offhand, something like that. 2 ISIS militants targeted a procession in Viterbo. Yeah, it'll land on my list. There's always too much to follow, as it happens. All right. Funny question. What is Noob's favorite food? Noob, where is he? He's right behind me. I actually, I don't know if I should say this, but I like to feed him meat, ground beef mostly, and which he really likes. Um, I try to actually cook it, but some say it's better raw. He's kind of open to both, but I try to keep him on I try to give him something that I would like and I could dig on as well. All right. Anyway, I'll come back to these, but I had stopped off at history. Okay. And we were talking about the last thing we discussed was the last thing we discussed was the conditions of Omar and how they sort of permeate Islamic thinking till this day, and how they inform the sort of supremacist approach and take that Muslims have towards Christians. And as I showed you, when you read it, it's all right there. It's just spelled out. Getting up off your seat. You have to actually open your. There's other elaborate versions where you have to, if a Muslim wants your home, you have to open your doors, let him sleep there, give him food, and all that sort of thing. And mind you, this was done at a time when Christians were still the majority, even though Arabs had conquered the Middle East. Okay, the conditions of Omar was written. They were still, the Arabs were sort of the warrior elite class. The vast majority of the peoples were still Christians. So as that shifted and it became more and more Muslims, as Christians ended up converting because of the high tax, a lot of Christians, they couldn't afford to pay the jizya, or others just wanted to be part of the winning team, Islam, and they didn't want to always be persecuted. So over the centuries, many Christians, of course, converted to Islam, which always leads to one of the funniest ironies, or actually most tragic ironies that I've always mentioned, which is that all the modern day Muslims who are persecuting Christians, especially in Arab nations, their forefathers and ancestors were persecuted Christians who converted in order to assuage their persecution and stop suffering at the hands of Muslims. So now their descendants continue carrying on the persecution. It's basically a very vicious cycle. Anyway, okay, so I talked about a little bit of doctrine. I gave you the Quran, and I also spoke about the conditions of Omar. So, but someone may say, okay, you know what? You mean you've quoted a handful of verses in some obscure document. Who cares? Well, what about the Old Testament? It's full of violence. That doesn't necessarily mean Christians are reading it, etc. You get that kind of argument all the time. And in fact, that's what drove me to want to write books about history, to say, okay, we know what Muslims are doctrinally commanded to do and how they're supposed to feel about infidels. But has that been the case historically? So that's been really, in the last few years, what I've been writing about. And the long and short of it is, yes, the history is a manifestation, a nonstop manifestation of the doctrine that I just quoted to you. All right. Everything that I just mentioned, whether, the hatred or the contempt, or, the church can't be built and the crosses can't be shown and you can't talk about God, Jesus. You can't try to convert anyone. You can't get in the way of your relatives being convert or compelled to become Muslims. That was a constant. Okay. It was a nonstop manifestation that was on display. But also remember, what we today call the Islamic world, especially the heart of it, which is the Middle East, or MENA, the Middle East and North Africa, right? So from Morocco in the west all the way to Egypt in North Africa, and then the Middle East, Syria, and all the modern names that they have, Israel, Lebanon, and Jordan, and also Turkey. That was the heart of the Christian world, right? in the 7th century when Islam came onto the scene. And that was the majority of it. And according to estimates by historians such as Thomas Madden, when it was all said and done, Muslims conquered 3/4 of the older, richer, more sophisticated, more advanced, more important Christian realm. People today, when you talk about Christendom, of course, they think of Europe, mostly Northern, Western Europe. They don't think of Egypt or Syria or Turkey, okay? But that actually was the heart of the of Christendom, that place now. And now you think of it as just as if Arabs and Muslims were always there. No, it was taken by force and violence and bloodshed. And most of it was very rapid in the 1st century. So from Muhammad's death in 632 till 732, that century, Muslims conquered that entire region, all of North Africa, all of the Middle East, not Turkey yet. That was coming later. Spain was now conquered, okay? And I say 732 because now you got Muslims in the middle of France, a battle of Tours, right? And so even a huge part of France suffered depredations for decades, actually. Most people think that after the Battle of Tours, that was the end of it. Actually, no. It stopped Islam from spreading deeper into France, but there were large pockets of Muslims in southern France that were still preying on the land. And yeah, during this time, there were Muslims in Switzerland as well. They actually had a base there that few people know. Okay. But anyway, so the history is one long, nonstop manifestation of the doctrine that I just read to you and the contempt for Christian infidels, especially. All right. And so we can fast forward to America and its very first war as a nation after it gained independence from Britain was with Muslims, the Barbary Wars, right? What were the Barbary Wars? Well, it was Muslims started once. So what was happening is when America was still part of the British Empire, the Brits were actually paying jizya, tribute, to the African pirates, the Muslim pirates of North Africa. It was basically ransom money, but it was seen by the Muslims as jizya. And it was money basically being paid to prevent the Muslim pirates from attacking British and, in connection at the time, American vessels, because they were part of the British Empire. After the war, of course, America was on its own. They didn't even know what was going on. And so immediately, once the Muslims got wind of this, they began attacking American vessels. Okay, this is even before Americans were able to elect their first president, George Washington. And anyway, they started attacking them, the horrific treatment to the sailors. They enslaved them. They killed them. There's a lot of nasty stuff about them. I discussed that in my book, Sword and Scimitar. And Thomas Jefferson, very famously, I've quoted this many times. It's also in that book that I just mentioned. Him and John Adams, they met with the ambassador of Barbary to try to ransom the Christians and basically, have a diplomatic exchange and create peace. And Jefferson and Adams said, look, we consider all men our friends. So instead of attacking us, why don't we have trade and work together? And the ambassador, Muhammad Abdul something, basically sounded like an ISIS spokesman. He said, well, it's part of our religion and our prophet and our Quran says you are the infidel, you are the enemy. We must lay in wait for you, ambush, kill you, and hold you hostage. Okay. So that's America's very first war, lest you have any doubts that that the history between Islam and Christendom is not a manifestation of the doctrines of hate and contempt for Christianity. And if you really want the details, here it is, Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and West. That's the book where you're going to see the historic persecution of Christians at the hands of Muslims over the centuries. But just to give you a little quote, summarizing all I've said, I like always to quote other people, lest, I get accused of making this all up. Here are the words of eminent historian Bernard Lewis. Okay, he writes, quote, for almost 1,000 years, from the first Moorish landing in Spain in 711 to the second Turkish siege of Vienna, 1683, Europe was under constant threat from Islam. All but the easternmost provinces of the Islamic realm had been taken from Christian rulers. North Africa, Egypt, Syria, even Persian-ruled Iraq had been Christian countries in which Christianity was older and more deeply rooted than in most of Europe. Their loss was sorely felt and heightened the fear that a similar fate was in store for Europe. Okay? So past and present, the bottom line is Muslims have persecuted Christians, and for the self-same reasons. It's an unwavering line of continuity, and so it's very hard to say whether this is this is not something to deal with Islam, like that Andalusian Islamic committee said about, we believe in, this is a isolated incident about the Muslim man burning and destroying a church. No, that actually is the norm, right? They're lying. But now we come to the big question, right? Why is such a perennial phenomenon, Muslim persecution of Christians that crosses centuries and continents, so unknown in the West? Well, because, and in what should be familiar by now, a familiar theme, the guardians of information, the gatekeepers, have suppressed it in an effort to serve a greater narrative. in this case, that Islam is peaceful and you need to open all your borders and have Muslims around you. And we see how that has worked out in places like Western Europe. So, for example, I was telling you about the Muslim persecution of Christian reports that I write for Gatestone Institute, going all the way back to 2011 every month. The overwhelming majority of the stories, the ones that I just read to you today, the very graphic ones, including the murder and starving a woman because she became a Christian, and telling her, let's kill your child because it's an infidel bastard, and dressing up like priests and massacring Christians who come in good faith. All of that will get almost zero attention, certainly in the mainstream media. The best I can tell is maybe CBN, the Christian Broadcasting Network, sometimes covers some of these stories, okay, to their credit. But all the large media, forget about it, all right? And as I'm going to show you, it's not only that they cover it, they actually go against it and try to, when people like me talk about it, they try to suppress it. And I'll give you actual examples of this, okay? But these stories that I mentioned, all of them, and even the innocuous ones where, they go and close a church saying you don't have the permit, okay? I guarantee you, if it was the opposite, if it was Christians doing this to Muslims or someone else, it would be all over the news, all right? And it doesn't matter if it's a foreign country, because a lot of people may say, well, who cares? Maybe they're not reporting because, well, it doesn't matter because it's a foreign country. But I thought we're supposed to care. We care about the wars in Ukraine, right? That's a foreign country. We care about what's happening with Israel and the Palestinians. That's a foreign country. Someone may say, well, what's happening in Nigeria is they're black. And I guess people really don't care about blacks. But I thought we were supposed to care. Black lives matter, right? So Black lives matter and foreign peoples matter. So how come we're not hearing about what's happening to all these people? The slaughters and the destruction and the constant, the raping and the abducting and the forced conversions of Christians to Muslims, and the entrenched forms of discrimination and persecution. Okay. And really, to underscore this and to show you it's not just the media, it's really the powers that be. Let me share with you a little anecdote. Okay. So remember, I think he's an Australian guy who went to New Zealand and he shot up a couple of mosques. And I think he killed, the number is 49 Muslims. All right. Now, you want to talk about isolated incidents. There it is. Okay. That doesn't really happen very often. I think that was the only one, at least in modern times, that I can recall. And how did the media respond to that? Do you remember? It was a nonstop, news story. And again, the alt-right, the Christian right, how evil they are, and you got to watch out for them. They're the most dangerous people, et cetera, et cetera. And then the United Nations, I think it was March 15th of whatever year, 21 or whatever, when this incident happened, the attack on the two mosques. The United Nations created a day on that, created a remembrance called Combat Islamophobia Day, and it's marked on March 15th to remember that horrific incident. Now, here's my question. I actually did a study and I wrote an article, and I think I did a video about it, where I showed that, okay, if you look at, because I've been following this, I told you I have all these reports, so all the material is accessible to me going back to 2011. And I looked at it, and long and short of it, I came across something like, I don't know how many dozens of Muslims attacking churches all around the world. With, I think the number was well over 1,000 Christians were killed, okay, in these attacks. And UN hasn't created a day about that. Why would not? Okay, so many churches being attacked, all by Muslims in various countries, with 1,000 Christians killed. In other words, this is a real phenomenon. No day combating Christianophobia. One attack, okay, by one man, and now we have to all stand up in our seat and never shut up and keep condemning what happened. And it's so, to your average person who doesn't know, let's say, what I know and what I'm telling you, if anything, it seems like Muslims are under attack by crazy Christians in their mosques. But we need a whole day to actually acknowledge this. But the Christians, well, and even when you look at it, it's oftentimes, do you recall Hillary Clinton and Obama, when one of the most horrific attacks happened on churches? It was in Easter, and I think several churches were bombed in Sri Lanka by Muslims. Something like 300 Christians were killed, and they couldn't even bring themselves to say the word Christian. They said Easter worshipers were killed, okay? And of course, they always dissemble the the identity of those who kill them, meaning Muslims and so forth. And so I'll give you a few more concrete examples. All right. So what I'll give you some examples, because I've really been following this for a while, of how the media are especially adept at getting around this topic, the Muslim persecution of Christians, and what they do. So first, what they do, here's their strategy. They only report on the most sensational attacks. Okay. So like I told you, the stuff that I read, it's not that big of a deal, massacring Christians here and there, because that they'll say it's just something else. It's climate change. But let's say a Muslim does go and bomb a church and 50 people die. All right, they feel like they have to kind of mention it, but they'll mention it and they'll give you the bare bone facts, okay? And they'll give you the bare bone facts, and it'll be very kind of hygienic, and you might not even know it has something to do with Christians, because at the very, very end, let's say it's not a church, okay, you won't see the word Christian. Maybe they'll mention the church, but you'll just hear people were killed. Or sometimes, let's say it's an attack, a big attack on a village, and it's intentionally Muslims targeting Christians. They won't tell you that. They'll say, especially in Nigeria, they'll say herdsmen, who are all Muslims, came and killed settled farmers, okay? And it'll look like a land dispute driven by climate change. Literally, that's what they say. But then you dig into it and you find that all the Muslim herdsmen were dressed in black, chanting Islamic slogans and screaming Allahu Akbar, kill the infidels. And that all the farmers were Christians, okay? But even though the media actually, reports on the most spectacular instances, because they have to, or else it looks overly suspicious, even that is very little. And so one report, I remember, I have it up here somewhere. Do you remember when 21 Coptic Christians, or 21 Copts and one Ghanan, an African man, had their heads sawed off in Libya by ISIS? And that happened because they would not renounce their faith in Christ. Think about how dramatic that is. I mean, that's a movie right there. And we've seen, if you've been unlucky to watch the full video like I have, what they did, which is, the 21 Christians were led out in their orange jumpsuits with ISIS men standing behind them, each one with a knife. And they're standing there praying. And then finally they knock them over, crane their heads back by putting their fingers in their eye sockets, and just start carving their heads off. Okay. Right. And that actually got 6 times less coverage than the killing of a hapless gorilla in America. I think its name was Harambe. Okay. Apparently a toddler fell into Harambe's enclosure, and that ended up with them having to kill the gorilla. Now, I feel bad for the gorilla, okay? I'm not making light of that, and I think that should have been reported. But honestly, should that get 6 times more coverage than 21 human beings having their heads carved off because they will not recant and refuse to renounce their Lord, Jesus Christ in this case? Makes you wonder, right? Now, the other strategy is, after they only talk about the most spectacular things. And that, by the way, another bonus for them when they only talk about spectacular attacks is it's always terrorists, formal terrorist groups. So they can make it look like, oh, it's this evil terrorist group that has nothing to do with Islam, and look what they did. They went and bombed the church and killed whatever they did. Okay. But if you know that that's just the tip of the iceberg, the visible tip, and that underneath it, there's much worse forms of persecution constantly going, the kind that I've already told you, you have a better idea that this is actually a real phenomenon, not just an aberration of these men who have stolen or who have hijacked Islam. So the second strategy is then they relativize everything. Okay, always trying to present it. So when Muslims attack Christians, it's a generic crime. They side play the identity of the Christians. They side play the identity of the Muslims. Like I told you in Nigeria, they'll call it a sectarian attack. I've read more than one report of terrorist attacks that killed dozens of people, only to find at the very end of the report, if I'm lucky, or if I'm able to piece it together and deduce it, that all those who were slain were Christians. Okay, and all those killing them were Muslims. This is all intentionally. All right. And all these unprovoked Muslim attacks on Christians are always portrayed as sectarian strife. That's the word I remember always seeing in the last decade or so, which is a word that is suggestive of two equally matched adversaries, right? This hardly describes reality. The reality is Muslim majority nations, Muslims are attacking Christian minorities with impunity. A New York Times headline, excuse me, for an Islamic terror attack on an Egyptian church that left 21 Christians dead was, quote, clashes grow as Egyptians remain angry after an attack. Okay. As if frustrated Christians, okay, who are finally lashing out and angry at the nonstop persecution is the big news that we have to worry about. And I remember I saw another report once and it showed militant Christians, Coptic Christians holding crosses and protesting. And so, if anything, it looks like it's sectarian strife. And the picture shows me angry Christians. It kind of looks like it's an even Steven match, or if anything, it's the Christians who are the aggressors. The reality is the opposite. But they found a nice little picture of frustrated Christians pushed through the wall, actually finally expressing their outrage and anger, etc. And that's how they label it and title it. All right. But of course, blurring the line between victim and oppressor, it's a very regular tactic of the mainstream media. And so I'll tell you about a BBC report that I recall, and I have records to all this. Okay, in two brief sentences, bare bone facts, the BBC report tells you of a church attack that left 3 Christians, including a toddler, dead. Okay, just very pure. It doesn't say even Christians. It says an attack on a church and then 2 people and a toddler were killed. And then it jumped to the really big news. It wrote, quote, the bombing sparked a riot by Christian youths with reports that at least 2 Muslims were killed in the violence. 2 men were dragged off their bikes after being stopped at a roadblock set up by the rioters. A row of Muslim-owned shops was also burned. The report goes on and on with a special section about very angry Christians until one all but confuses the victims with the persecutors, not to mention forgets what the Christians are angry about in the first place, which is on nonstop, unprovoked terror attacks, a genocide against Christians. Okay, if I recall, the most recent tally is something like 60,000 Christians have been killed at the hands of Muslims since about 2009. Okay, but we're told about reprisals that led to the killing of 2 Muslims after yet another church was attacked and Christians, including a toddler, were killed. That's the real story you have to keep in mind. So that again is a way of relativizing it in your mind. We're forced to respond. We have to talk about this Christian persecution nonsense. Okay, let's do all that we can to make it all look neutral, and if anything, let's make the Christians look like the aggressors. Okay, and a final deplorable strategy that I have personally seen and I have it documented is that the media sometimes issues false news in an effort to suppress what Muslims are doing to Christians. In the days before the 21 Christians, the Copts and the Ghanan, had their heads carved off in Libya, I was actually, because I had access to a lot of sources, including in Arabic and people on the ground, and I was writing a lot about it and warning about it. And then all of a sudden, a few days before the video came out with their heads being chopped off, the BBC falsely reported that the majority of those now slaughtered Copts were released. Okay. And then a few days later, we found out, no, they actually had their heads carved off. Why did the BBC go out of the way to say that? Okay. Makes you think. Let's see. Takes a few more comments. And I'm almost done. I'm going to wrap it up. So, solutions. Ban Islam. How about let's just start recognizing what Islam is? How about honestly having an honest discussion about Islam, bringing forth its doctrines, discussing its history, and then letting the conclusion organically develop. Okay. To say ban Islam now in a vacuum to most people sounds absurd. What about religious freedom? But if you actually are able to show that Islam is more of a political ideology, if anything, okay, and it really is, it's more concerned with politics than it is about a spiritual relationship with God and so forth, I think things may become a little clearer. Why does the most persecuted religion in the world not have its own phobia word? Yeah. in Canada, Muslims said a church had to be given to them for use, or else it was Islamophobia, truly a new jihad. Well, yeah, if there's the most persecuted religion in the world is Christians. That's actually a fact that's been documented in many places. But like I said, where is that word phobia? Where was combat Christian phobia for the UN? Why don't we have that day? Created it for Islamophobia because of one attack on a mosque, 50 lives, 49 Muslim lives. But non-stop habitual attacks on Christian churches happening in all the Muslim countries, okay, whether it's East Asian, whether it's Arab, whether it's Turkic nations, whether, of course, it's sub-Saharan nations. Doesn't that tell you that this is a real phenomena that transcends nationality and ethnic identity and race? This is a real phenomena that needs addressing. Not a word. Can't say Christianophobia. And this is why it's time for people to wake up and realize this is all by design. Okay, I remember for the longest time when we talk about these topics, people in America love to say how dumb, their politicians are. They don't get it. No, they get it. All right, and the biggest gift you can give them is to think of them as dumb. I remember this a lot, especially with George W. Bush. Everyone's like, "He's so dumb. He's so dumb." No, the guy's not stupid. They want you to think they're dumb. Okay, that's the way they can get away with stuff. I'm not talking specifically about Bush. I'm just talking about all politicians and all the people who are in charge, who are responsible for what we learn, what we hear, and what we don't hear, and the policies that are being made. Okay, so the final issue that we will talk about now is how this issue, Muslim persecution of Christians, is really metastasizing and growing at an alarming rate. And it's not even limited to the Islamic world anymore. It's becoming a very real thing. Okay, in 2021, I looked at these World Watch List reports, and I did a little number crunching. Okay, at the time, and basically, I looked at it, and the statistics then were that 340 million Christians were experiencing high levels of persecution. Okay, that was a 31% increase from 2020, which was only 260 million experienced it. And 2020 was a 6% increase from 2019, when that number was 245 million Christians. And that was a 14% increase from 2018, which was only 215 million Christians. In short, between just 2018 and 2021, between 2018 and the most recent report, which I'm now adding in, 2024, the persecution of Christians has shot up by more than 70% in 60 years. Okay, 70%. And it will likely continue to metastasize and grow. So even though Muslim nations, as I pointed out, have the lion's share of the persecution of Christians, it's rapidly spreading into non-Muslim nations as well, including ones you would not expect. India, as we saw, is an extreme persecutor. That's the worst label. It's ranked number 11, according to the World Watch List, persecutor of Christians. But then nations like Mexico, neighboring Mexico, once thought to be a bastion of conservative Catholicism, it's on the list. Christians are being persecuted. Where else? Nicaragua, also at the same time. By who? Not by Muslims, but by authoritarian governments, leftist governments often, and other criminal elements. Okay. Of course, in China and so forth. So it's really spreading everywhere, all around the world. It's getting worse and worse. It's getting worse in the Muslim nations. And now it's also spreading to non-Muslim nations. Myanmar, Buddhists are now attacking and persecuting Christians, right? And yet, most Americans, especially, it would seem to me, Christians, have no idea of what's going on. Or if they do, the extent or the significance of it, right? And if the current trajectory doesn't change, and I see no reason it will, and they remain in the dark, the persecution is going to start hitting closer to home. All right. By which time, accurate reporting won't even be necessary. And the persecution won't be of the war on Christmas type. Okay. It's going to be the kind that I've just been reading to you. Remember, it's not just Muslims. Remember what I told you in another stream about the Charlie Kirk murder and the left, and what the left and Islam really have in common. Okay. Obviously, there's nothing in common superficially. One's extreme liberal or insane. One's extreme conservative and very patriarchal. So why are they, but they follow the same mode. Okay. Once I have no doubt that once the left, and as you know, I hate that word, is in absolute power, get ready to see the same sorts of things happening. No doubt whatsoever. The people telling you, the elements telling you about how you need to be tolerant, how you need to, not trigger someone, and you got to walk on eggshells. They're the first ones that are going to throw all that out once they're in power. Wait and see. And, I'm going to close off with what we started, the Nigerian priest that we spoke about, because as I listened to him, I had a sort of deja vu moment, because it demonstrated a sort of continuity, but a very interesting one. As I was listening to him, and as I read what I read and what I read to you about what Muslims are doing to Christians, it just reminded me that, this is what the First Crusade was about. This is what they heard. So if you heard the Nigerian priest, he was telling you about how Muslims are attacking and killing and destroying. And I've read to you numerous accounts about how that's happening today in the now. And that's exactly what the Crusaders are. All right. If you look, I have a lot of quotes in my book, Sword and Scimitar, where because Muslims at that time, especially the Turks, who were pretty ascendant at the time, were engaged in horrific massacres and persecutions of Christians in the East, okay, in Asia Minor especially, which is now taken over. Now it's Turkey, but also in the Holy Land as well. And Christians in the West heard of it. That news came to them, just like you heard the Nigerian priest, and you heard me tell you this, and you've heard others perhaps, and you've seen what's going on. How did they respond? Well, they decided it was time to go to war. They had to that's what launched the First Crusade. And they just, that's the Deus Vult, God wills it. And the irony is these guys had to, they had to actually travel. They had to lose their land and their property and give away things. And, and a lot of them were wealthy nobles, and they lost everything, and they traveled on foot. Just getting there was extreme suffering. And then, of course, they fought disease and famine, and many of them died. Okay. And now, isn't it ironic that on the one hand, Christians in the West demonize those guys and say, oh, those guys were horrible, good Christians. And on the other hand, here in the West, Christians don't even have to do what those guys did, which is what I just described to you, which is travel and suffer and give everything away. Here in the West, mere words, diplomacy, sanctions could stop everything I just told you, all right, by the US and other Western governments. But they would never do that. They would never dream about interfering or even calling Muslims out. In fact, in many cases, they're facilitating it. What's happening in Nigeria, especially under Obama, it was well known, according to every Nigerian, including many Christian officials, he was facilitating and he was behind this. And so were Bill Clinton, because he was also somehow, he had some business dealings in Nigeria. And he used to say, oh, all this stuff is just about land dispute and things of that nature. So it's kind of interesting, isn't it? What those evil, horrible, mean Christians did and what they gave away and what they suffered because they heard the same stories we're hearing. And here we can't even, get our leaders to just say a word, make a sanction, or do something which would immediately stop this. So I think that should give you an idea of the current rot and the current climate that we're living in all ways. So there it is. Everything's is rigged. Everything is set. The persecution of Christians around the world is growing, and it's getting worse, and it's multiplying, and it will be coming soon to a theater near you. It's going to be coming to all those doormat Christians who think it's their duty never to even judge or say anything. It's rude to call out Muslims and say this is happening until it comes to their doorsteps. And I will end it there. See if we have any more. All right. All right. Don't mean to get off topic, but what are your favorite books, authors on the Crusades besides yourself? My favorite Crusade writers are the primary sources. All right. William of Tyre, he's the main one. But and if you're really interested, you can check out my books, Sword and Scimitar and Defenders of the West, because the bibliography section, the works cited, are about 15, 20 pages, and you can see all the sources I use, and also secondary sources. I have some there, but generally my interest is the primary sources. Okay. Thanks for being a member, Mark. What gives you the bravery to speak critically of Islam when you endanger your life and families? I'm too scared. Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. I just feel someone has to do it. Someone has to talk about it. It's very rare, I think, for Christians to talk about the persecution of Christians. Western Christians like to talk about other religions and what's good or bad for them. So I'm going to be that rare, crazy Christian who actually keeps an eye out for Christians and Christendom at large. Yeah, of course it's dangerous, but there's worse things in life than being preyed upon for getting the truth out or being engaged in a noble endeavor. Imagine a crusade to early Medina. Yeah, I would have nipped it in the bud, right? That poor Assyrian Christian man in France fled Iraq to get away from Islamic persecution, only to be killed by a Muslim in France. Yeah. They're talking about, if you don't know, but the same day that Charlie Kirk was killed, September 10th, a Christian man in France was executed in his house, a crippled man in a wheelchair who, escaped Iraq and was just talking about religion, but apparently he offended a Muslim, which France is full of, and he got killed too. All right, everyone. Thanks for joining me. This was another record. I went a long time. I'm trying to build up stamina for this. Thanks for joining me again. And until next time, farewell.